The wind tasted like dust and judgment. In the center of the square, Clara Wynne stood on a wooden block, her dignity for sale. She was 22 years old. Her father, a man who saw her as nothing more than a failed crop, shouted to the crowd, "She can cook, she can sew, and she keeps quiet." The crowd murmured, a low rumble of curiosity and contempt. A few men sized her up, their eyes cold and calculating, like they were bidding on livestock. But then her father delivered the killing blow, the two words that had already stolen her life once before. "She's barren," he announced, his voice flat and final. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Tried for years, nothing. But she's got strong hands. A man could find a use for her. The silence that followed was worse than any jeer. The crowd knew the show was over. A damaged good, not worth the trouble. Clara stared at a loose board on the saloon porch, focusing on the splintered wood, trying to disappear. She remembered begging her husband, the man who had promised her forever, not to cast her out. She remembered the shame of returning to her father's house, a failure in the only way that mattered. Pleading had never worked. So she stood silent, a ghost in a faded blue dress. She could feel her mother in the crowd, a shadow who offered no comfort, no protest, just another face turning away. Then, through the parting crowd, a man appeared. He was broad-shouldered, coated in the dust of a long road, his face hidden by the wide brim of his hat. He didn't inspect her like the others. He didn't haggle. He walked straight to her father, pulled a heavy leather pouch from his coat, and dropped a cascade of coins on the table. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. Her father's eyes widened. "You sure?" he asked, a greedy smile touching his lips. "She don't come with a refund." The stranger didn't even look at Clara. His voice was low, a gravelly sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "She's mine." He turned and walked toward a waiting wagon without a second glance. The deal was done. The crowd, robbed of its cruel entertainment, began to scatter. Her father gave her a final, rough shove. "Go on," he grunted. "You belong to him now." Clara picked up her small satchel, her only possessions in the world, and followed the dark shape of the man who had just bought her. She didn't know if she was walking toward salvation or just a different kind of cage. The wagon seat was hard, the silence beside the stranger harder. He didn't speak as they left the town behind, the dust swallowing the last remnants of her old life. The prairie opened up, vast and empty, a terrifyingly blank page. He handed her a canteen without a word. The water was metallic and warm, but she drank it down, her throat raw from unshed tears. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands on the reins were scarred and capable. The lines on his face were carved by the sun, and something deeper, something she couldn't name. He could be 30 or 50. Life on this land aged men in strange ways. The silence stretched for miles, broken only by the plodding of the mules and the creak of the wheels. She had to know. Her voice was a dry crackle when she finally spoke. "Why?" He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if he were navigating by some invisible star. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red before he finally answered. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. 5 reasons. Just 2 words, but they landed like stones in her gut. 5 reasons. What did that mean? Her mind raced. Was he a lawman, a bounty hunter? Did he have 5 debts to pay? The possibilities were all sharp edges and dark corners. "I don't understand," she whispered. He finally turned his head, and in the fading light she saw his eyes. They were a startling pale gray, and they held no warmth at all. "You will," he said, and then he said nothing more. By dusk, the wagon pulled up to a ranch that looked like it was clinging to the land by its fingernails. The house was a dark shape against the bruised purple sky, leaning as if tired of fighting the wind. A weathered barn stood behind it like a silent sentinel. Chickens scattered as they approached. The man, who she now knew was named Thomas, climbed down. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't wait to see if she would follow. He just walked toward the house, his steps heavy and sure. Clara hesitated, her hand clutching her satchel. This was it, the edge of the world. She took a breath and slid off the wagon, her boots landing softly in the dust. The porch groaned under her weight as she followed him. There was no proper door, just a thick, stained quilt hanging in the frame. He pushed it aside and disappeared into the darkness within. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought about running. But where would she go? Back to the town that sold her? Back to the father who threw her away? She pushed the quilt aside and stepped inside. And that's when she saw them. The 5 reasons. 5 small faces turned toward her, lit by the weak glow of a single lantern. 4 boys and 1 girl, arranged in a silent row on the floor. They weren't curious, they weren't welcoming. Their eyes were wide and dark and utterly still, like frightened animals caught in a trap. They had lost their mother 2 winters ago, the story went, but the hush in this cabin felt older and colder than grief. "This is Clara," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the small space. "She'll be staying." He didn't introduce the children. He didn't need to. They were a single entity, a 5-headed guardian of some terrible secret. The youngest, a boy of no more than 5, broke from the line and wrapped his arms around Thomas's leg, burying his face in his father's trousers. Thomas scooped him up in one arm, his expression unchanging. "There's a room upstairs," he said to Clara, gesturing with his free hand. "Water's in the bucket." She didn't dare ask which room. She just nodded and climbed the narrow, creaking stairs. The room was little more than a closet with a bed. A single window looked out onto an endless sea of dying grass. She set down her satchel and sank onto the thin mattress. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she sat perfectly still, listening to the silence of the 5 children downstairs, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house. And she felt a cold dread creep into her bones. She hadn't been brought here to be a mother. She had been brought here for something else entirely. Morning came with the smell of weak coffee and the sound of floorboards groaning under a heavy tread. Clara came downstairs to find the children exactly where they had been the night before, sitting at the rough-hewn table, their faces pale and watchful. They moved around her with a spooky, silent coordination. Judah, the eldest, maybe 12, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed with a man's suspicion. He watched every move she made, his gaze a physical weight. The 2 middle boys, Levi and Gideon, whispered to each other, their words too low to hear, but their quick, darting glances at her were anything but subtle. Mira, the only girl, clutched a dirty scrap of blue cloth, twisting it in her fingers until her knuckles were white. And Samson, the youngest, just stared, his eyes huge and unblinking. It wasn't the wary curiosity of children meeting a stranger. It was the calculated observation of guards on duty. Clara tried to make herself useful, to prove she wasn't a threat. But her hands, usually so steady, betrayed her. The beans she put on to boil turned to a gray, unappetizing mush. The bread she tried to bake came out of the oven as a dense, flat stone. When she reached for the coffee pot, the hot tin handle seared her palm. She gasped, dropping it, and bitter black liquid spilled across the floorboards like a dark omen. She bit back a cry of pain and frustration, her eyes stinging. The children didn't move. They just watched her failure in complete silence. She spent the rest of the morning scrubbing the floor, mending a torn shirt with shaking fingers, trying to become invisible. But the house itself seemed to be against her. The needle pricked her finger, drawing blood. The thread snapped. A floorboard seemed to catch her foot, sending her stumbling. By afternoon, her nerves were frayed raw. She took a deep breath and lifted the heavy cast-iron pot of stew from the fire. Her palms were slick with steam. She took a careful step toward the table, and then something, or someone, brushed past her leg. The pot tilted. Her grip failed. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clang, sending hot stew splattering across the room. This time, a sound escaped her, a small, choked sob. The cabin went absolutely still. The children froze, their faces tight with a strange, dark expectation. They weren't waiting for an adult to get angry. They were waiting for something much worse. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was braced for a blow, for a harsh word, for the punishment she had learned to expect. The front door quilt was pushed aside. Thomas stepped in. His eyes took in the scene, the spilled stew, the shattered calm, her terrified face. He looked from the mess on the floor to the 5 silent children, and then his gaze settled on her. There was no anger, no disappointment. There was nothing. His face was a complete blank. He crouched down, picked up the empty pot, and started wiping the floor with a rag, his movements efficient and detached. "It's just stew," he said, his voice perfectly level. But as he stood up, his eyes met Judah's, the eldest boy, and in that one fleeting glance, a silent message passed between them. It was a look of shared understanding, of a secret kept, and Clara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the pot hadn't just slipped. One of them had made her drop it, and their father knew. He knew, and he did nothing. He set the pot by the sink and walked back outside without another word, leaving her alone in the wreckage, surrounded by 5 pairs of cold, watchful eyes. She wasn't just an outsider here. She was the enemy. That night, the house was quieter than a tomb. Clara lay awake on her thin mattress, listening to the wind and the secrets that seemed to whisper from the walls. Sometime after midnight, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound from the room next door. A child's cough. But it wasn't a normal cough. It was a dry, rasping sound, thin and weak. She slipped out of bed and crept to the door. It was Mira's room. The little girl was tossing in her sleep, her face flushed, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. Clara reached out and touched her. The heat was terrifying. She was burning up. Fever. The same fever, the whispers in town said, that had taken their mother. Panic seized Clara for a second, cold and sharp. But then something else took over. An instinct she didn't know she had. She had to do something. She ran from the room and nearly collided with Thomas in the narrow hall. He was already awake, a lantern in his hand, his face a grim mask. It was as if he had been waiting for this. "She's sick," Clara whispered, her voice urgent. "I need willow bark and mint. Do you have any?" He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face in the flickering light. He seemed to be weighing a decision of immense gravity. She expected him to question her, to dismiss her. Instead, he gave a single, curt nod. He disappeared down the stairs and returned with a small bundle of dried herbs. He thrust them into her hands. "Do what you can," he said, and his voice held a note of something she hadn't heard before. Desperation. Clara worked through the night. She crushed the bark, steeped it in hot water, and bathed Mira's face and wrists with the bitter tea. She held the small, trembling body against her own, rocking back and forth, humming a half-remembered lullaby from a life that felt 1,000 years ago. The fever was a relentless, living thing. Mira's breath came in ragged gasps. Once, in her delirium, she cried out a name. "Sarah!" Her voice was a frightened whisper. "Don't be angry, Mama, please." Clara froze. Sarah, their mother's name. Don't be angry. What had the child meant? The hours blurred into a long, nightmarish vigil. Clara fought against sleep, her body aching with exhaustion, but she refused to let go. She held on as if her own life depended on it. And maybe it did. Just as the first pale hint of dawn touched the window, the fever broke. Mira's breathing eased. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at Clara, her gaze clear for the first time. A tiny smile touched her lips. "Pancakes?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Relief washed over Clara so intensely it almost brought her to her knees. "Soon," she promised, her own voice thick with emotion. She looked up and saw Thomas standing in the doorway. He had been there all night, a silent, hulking shadow. The worry hadn't left his face, but as he looked at Clara, something in his expression softened, cracked just a little. He wasn't looking at a hired hand or a woman he'd bought. He was looking at someone who had stood between his child and the grave. And in that moment, she realized the truth. This wasn't just a fever, it was a test. And for reasons she couldn't possibly understand, she had just passed. The next morning, an uneasy truce had settled over the cabin. When Clara came downstairs, the children were still quiet, but the hostility in their eyes had been replaced by a grudging curiosity. On the stove, a kettle was already steaming. Next to it was a tin mug, and tucked under the handle was a small folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she opened it. 2 words were scratched onto the paper in a stiff, childish hand. "Thank you." There was no name, but she knew. She looked over at Judah. The boy was staring determinedly into his bowl of oatmeal, but the tips of his ears were bright red. He had seen what she did for his sister. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt a tiny crack in the wall of ice that surrounded this family. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was a start. Later that day, she was washing clothes in a barrel behind the house when Samson, the youngest, toddled up to her. He pointed a chubby finger at a small, stubborn maple sapling growing near the fence. "Maple," he said, his voice full of conviction, as if he were bestowing a great honor. Then he looked at her and said it again. "Maple." He wrapped his small arms around her legs and squeezed. Clara froze. What did he mean? Was he naming her, like a pet? But then he looked up at her and grinned, a pure, unadulterated child's grin, and she felt her own lips curve into a smile in response. A real one. It felt foreign on her face. Spring slowly warmed the land, and a fragile rhythm began to form in the house. Clara's hands remembered their old skills. Her bread started to rise, golden and fragrant. She found she could mend the boy's torn trousers with neat, even stitches. She discovered a small cache of colored ribbons in an old trunk and started braiding Mira's hair each morning, tying the ends in bright bows. The girl would stand perfectly still, her eyes closed, as if the simple act of being touched gently was a miracle. Clara started telling them stories at night, her voice low and steady in the flickering firelight. Stories of brave knights and clever animals, worlds away from their harsh reality. They still didn't speak to her much, but they started leaving her things. A smooth gray stone on her pillow, a wildflower tucked into her apron pocket, small, silent offerings. They were testing her, she realized, watching to see if she would stay. One evening at supper, Levi, the quietest of the boys, was passing her the bowl of beans. "Here, Mama," he mumbled, not looking at her. The word dropped into the silence of the room like a stone into a deep well. Everyone froze. Levi's face flushed crimson. Clara held her breath. He hadn't meant to say it. It had just slipped out. But no one corrected him, and Clara didn't say a word. The next day, Gideon said it, then Mira, a soft whisper, and finally Samson, shouting it with glee as he ran to her. They hadn't asked. They had simply decided. She was Mama now. That night she found Thomas on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted prairie. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, his voice rough. "I did," she admitted softly. "Every day." She took a breath. "But no one here is asking me to be something I'm not." Thomas just nodded, and in that simple gesture she felt a profound shift. She wasn't a prisoner here anymore. She was home, but she still didn't know what secrets this home was hiding. The uneasy peace was shattered by a trip to town. The ranch needed salt and nails, and Thomas asked her to ride with him. The moment their wagon rolled down the main street, Clara felt the old shame rise in her throat like bile. The stares, the whispers. It was the same town, the same people who had watched her be sold like an animal. While Thomas was in the general store, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cruel. "Well, well, if it isn't the Barren ghost." Clara turned. Her former mother-in-law, a woman whose face was a permanent sneer, stood by the dry goods stall, and next to her, her hand placed proudly on her swollen belly, was her ex-husband's new wife. "Still haunting the living, I see," the older woman spat. The younger one laughed, a high, tinkling sound that grated on Clara's nerves. "Is that her?" she asked, loud enough for half the town to hear. "The one who couldn't give him a son?" "The very same," her mother-in-law confirmed, "useless as a dry well. But don't you worry, my dear. You'll give us a fine, healthy boy, a proper heir." The words were designed to cut, and they did. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to hide. Then a shadow fell over her. Thomas had emerged from the store, a heavy sack over his shoulder. He didn't say a word to the two women. He didn't even acknowledge their presence. He just looked at Clara, but his eyes, usually so distant, were blazing with a cold fire. He set the sack down and took a step forward, placing himself between Clara and her tormentors. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, but it carried across the square. "This woman," he said, his voice like rolling thunder, "nursed my daughter back from a fever that would have killed a lesser soul. She taught my sons to read. She put a light back in a house that had gone dark." He paused, and his gaze was so intense it seemed to suck the air from the square. "She is worth more than you and your entire bloodline combined." The two women stared, their mouths agape. The town square had gone silent. Thomas didn't wait for a reply. He picked up his sack, nodded at Clara, and said, "Let's go." As they walked back to the wagon, the whispers that followed them were no longer of contempt, but of awe. That night, sitting on the porch, Clara looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." Thomas kept his eyes on the horizon. "I didn't do it for them," he said, and Clara understood. He had done it for her. But as she watched the hard line of his jaw in the moonlight, a new unsettling thought took root. His defense hadn't just been kind. It had been fiercely, terrifyingly possessive. It wasn't the act of a friend. It was the act of a man protecting his property. The darkness on the ranch had a different texture now. It wasn't just secrets. It was danger. One night, Clara went to the well for water, the bucket heavy in her hand. A figure stumbled out of the shadows of the barn. It was Clay, one of the ranch hands Thomas hired from time to time, a man with whiskey on his breath and malice in his eyes. "Well now," he slurred, blocking her path. "Look what we have here, the rancher's little pet." Clara's stomach clenched. "Let me pass, Clay." He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "I heard you was barren. That true? Guess that means you ain't good for much. But maybe I can find a use for you." He lunged, his hand clamping around her wrist like a manacle. His fingers dug into her skin, his face twisted into a leering grin. "Thomas ain't gotta know everything, does he?" Clara opened her mouth to scream, but before any sound came out, a shape exploded from the darkness of the house. It was Thomas. He moved with a speed that was unnatural for a man his size. There was a sickening crack as his fist connected with Clay's jaw. The ranch hand went down hard, spitting blood and curses into the dirt. Thomas didn't stop. He hauled Clay to his feet by the collar of his shirt and slammed him against the side of the well. The wood groaned in protest. "You don't touch her," Thomas snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl that was barely human. "She is mine." Clay, dazed and bleeding, tried to laugh. "She ain't your wife. She's just—" Thomas hit him again, a brutal, efficient blow that silenced him for good. Clay crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Thomas stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into bloody fists. He was breathing like an animal that had just made a kill. Then he turned to Clara. He looked at the red marks on her wrist where Clay had grabbed her. Without a word, he tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and gently, almost reverently, wrapped it around her wrist, covering the bruises. His touch was feather-light, a shocking contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. He looked into her eyes, and the fury was gone, replaced by something colder, something she couldn't decipher. "No one," he said, his voice a deadly vow, "will ever lay a hand on you again." He dragged Clay's limp body toward the edge of the property and dumped him like a sack of trash. As Clara watched him walk back to the house, the lantern light catching the blood on his knuckles, she was trembling. But it wasn't just from fear. He had protected her, but his protection felt like a brand, a claim. He hadn't saved a woman. He had defended his territory, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Life on the ranch became a tightrope walk. Clara was Mama, the heart of the house, but she was also a captive, bound to this place by a man whose protection was as frightening as any threat. The children, sensing the shift, grew closer to her. They had chosen her, and they would defend their choice. One afternoon, Gideon was playing with one of his father's whittling knives. Despite Clara's warnings, he was trying to carve a toy soldier from a block of wood. A sharp cry sliced through the quiet afternoon. Clara was there in an instant. The boy sat in the dust, his face white, clutching his forearm. A deep, ugly gash was welling with blood. Without a second of hesitation, Clara's training, the hard-won knowledge of a woman who had tended to farm accidents her whole life, took over. "Hold still," she said, her voice calm and commanding. She ripped a clean strip from her apron and pressed it tight against the wound. Thomas came running from the barn, his face a mask of fear. But when he saw Clara's competent, steady hands, he stopped. "Clean cloth," she ordered, not looking up. "And the whiskey from the cabinet." He didn't argue. He just ran to obey. As she cleaned the wound and stitched it closed with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, the other children gathered around, their small faces a mixture of fear and awe. Gideon didn't cry. He just watched her, his eyes full of a dawning understanding. When she tied the final knot and bandaged his arm, Gideon looked up at her. His voice was small, but clear as a bell. "Thank you, Mama." It was the way he said it, not as a slip of the tongue, but as a statement of fact, a declaration. He was claiming her in front of his father, in front of everyone. "He saved me, Thomas," she thought, looking at the boy. "He saved me with a single word." Thomas stood in the doorway, watching. He had seen her cook, clean, and face down her past. But this was different. He was watching a mother claim her son, and a son claim his mother. This wasn't a transaction. This was a bond, forged in blood and trust. He walked over and placed a heavy hand on Clara's shoulder. His gaze met hers over the heads of the children. "His mother," Thomas said, his voice thick with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. Her hands were never that steady. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his late wife in front of her, and the words held a strange, double meaning. It was a compliment to Clara, but what was it about Sarah? A chill went down her spine. Why wouldn't a mother's hands be steady for her own wounded child? Another piece of the puzzle, dark and misshapen, fell into her lap. She was beloved by these children. She was protected by their father. But she was living in a house haunted by a ghost named Sarah, and she was beginning to suspect that the fever wasn't what had killed her. The house held its breath at night. Clara would lie awake listening, certain she could hear the faint sound of weeping coming from the walls. She started searching. When Thomas and the boys were out mending fences, she explored the corners of the house she had never dared to touch. In the back of a dusty wardrobe, tucked away under a pile of old blankets, she found a small leather-bound diary. The handwriting inside was delicate, looping, and frantic. It was Sarah's. The first few entries were happy. Notes about her wedding, the birth of Judah, the beauty of the prairie. But then the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting more jagged. He watches me. He never speaks, but he is always watching. A few pages later, the silence is the worst part. This house is a prison of silence. I think I am going mad. Clara's blood ran cold. She flipped through the pages. The children look at me with his eyes. They don't trust me. They are his, not mine. And then, the last entry, dated just a week before she died. The ink was smudged, as if by tears. He brought a new herb from town. For my nerves, he said, it has a bitter taste. My hands won't stop shaking. I am so tired, so very tired. Clara slammed the book shut, her heart pounding. It wasn't a fever. It was poison. Slow-acting, subtle poison, administered by her own husband. The man who had saved her. The man who protected her with such terrifying violence. He hadn't just needed a mother for his children. He needed a replacement for the wife he had murdered. She felt sick. She was living in a dead woman's house, sleeping in a dead woman's room, raising a dead woman's children, married in all but name to her killer. Every act of kindness he had ever shown her was now tainted, twisted into something monstrous. His protection wasn't for her, it was to preserve his new, compliant wife. His silence wasn't stoicism, it was the cold calculation of a predator. She had to get away. She had to take the children and run. But how? He was always watching, just like he had watched Sarah. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Clara could barely look at Thomas. Every time he spoke, every time he moved, she saw Sarah's words scrawled in her mind. He was a monster, wearing the mask of a grieving husband. She put the children to bed, her hands trembling as she tucked them in. They were innocent. They were victims, just as she was. She had to save them. After they were asleep, she found Thomas on the porch, sharpening a knife by lantern light, the blade scraping rhythmically against the stone. The sound set her teeth on edge. She had to know. She had to confront him. She stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "Thomas," she began, her voice shaking, "we need to talk about Sarah." He didn't stop sharpening the knife. The scraping continued, steady and unnerving. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat. "She got sick. She died." "Is that what happened?" Clara pressed, her fear giving way to a reckless anger. "Or did your silence drive her mad? Did you watch her waste away until there was nothing left?" He finally stopped. The silence that fell was heavy and absolute. He slowly placed the knife and the stone on the railing and turned to face her. His face in the lantern light was a terrifying landscape of shadows and hard angles. "You found the diary," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara flinched. "She was afraid of you," she whispered. "She thought you were poisoning her." Thomas took a step toward her, and she instinctively stepped back. "I was," he said, and the two words hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, her mind reeling. He had admitted it. He was a murderer. "But it wasn't the kind of poison you think," he continued, his voice low and ragged with a pain that sounded terrifyingly real. "Sarah, she wasn't like you, Clara. The land was too much for her. The silence, the loneliness, it broke her. She was from a big city, from a wealthy family that never approved of me. She thought she wanted this life, but she was wrong." He ran a hand through his hair. She started getting sick in her mind. She thought the children were turning against her. She thought I was trying to hurt her. The doctor said it was melancholy, a sickness of the spirit. He gave me herbs to calm her nerves. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes pleading. The poison wasn't in the herbs, Clara. It was in her head. One night I found her in the barn. She had tried to end it. I stopped her. But after that, she was gone. The woman I married was gone. All that was left was the fear. The fever took her body a month later, but her spirit was already dead. Clara stared at him, torn between the frantic words in the diary and the raw agony on his face. Could he be telling the truth? Was Sarah's diary the ramblings of a troubled mind, not the testimony of a victim? Her family, Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. They blamed me. They said I drove her to it. They tried to take the children. That's why I brought you here. The final piece clicked into place. You needed an outcast, Clara breathed. Someone with no family, no one to speak for her. Someone the town had already thrown away. If I ran to the sheriff and told him you were a monster, who would believe me? Yes, he admitted, shamefaced. It was wrong. It was a cage, and I locked you in it. But it's not a cage anymore, Clara. Not for me. I see you with the children. I see the life you've brought back to this house. You're not her replacement. You're everything. He took a hesitant step closer. I'll let you go, he said, his voice cracking. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. You can take the children with you. They chose you. They're more yours than they ever were hers. Clara looked from his tortured face to the quiet house behind him, the house she had filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of laughter. She thought of the children sleeping peacefully in their beds. They were her children. This was her home. She had been bought. She had been trapped. She had been terrified. But she had also been chosen. No, she said, her voice stronger than she ever thought it could be. I'm not leaving. This is my family, and we don't leave family behind. A fragile trust began to grow between them, built on the ashes of Sarah's memory. But the outside world was not finished with them yet. A drought settled on the land, scorching the earth and turning the sky to a brassy, unforgiving dome. The well ran low. The crops withered. Thomas worked himself to the bone, his face growing gaunter with each passing day, until he collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Clara nursed him just as she had nursed Mira, her resolve a steel barrier against the punishing sun. She started a small garden by the porch, hauling buckets of precious water from the dwindling well, whispering to the struggling seedlings as if her own hope could will them to grow. And one day, a miracle, a single perfect red tomato, glowing like a jewel against the cracked earth. She held it up for Thomas to see, and in that moment, as the children cheered, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of gratitude, a quiet promise sealed in the heart of the drought. They were survivors. They were a family. But their newfound peace was short-lived. A polished wagon rolled up to the ranch one afternoon, carrying two men in clean city suits. They were from the railroad. They unrolled a map on the kitchen table, a thick black line slicing right through Thomas's land. It's the perfect grade, one of them said with a slick smile. The company is prepared to make you a very generous offer, enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere greener. Thomas just stared out the window at Clara's defiant little garden. We're not selling, he said. The railroad man's smile faltered. Sir, with all due respect, this is progress. You can't stand in the way of progress. He leaned in, his voice dropping. Besides, we've heard things in town about your first wife, about how you live out here. A man with secrets can't afford to make powerful enemies. It was a threat veiled in a business offer. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Get off my land. The men left, but the threat lingered in the air. A week later, a new wagon appeared on the horizon. This one was familiar. Clara's heart sank as she recognized her former mother-in-law stepping down, followed by her smirking ex-husband, and with them was the town sheriff and one of the men from the railroad. Thomas, the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. These folks have filed a complaint. They're petitioning for custody of the children. They say this is an unfit home. On what grounds? Thomas demanded, his body rigid. Clara's ex-husband stepped forward. On the grounds that you're a murderer, he said, his voice ringing with false righteousness. You killed our Sarah, and now you're keeping her children prisoner with this barren woman you bought in a public square. The final battle had arrived at their doorstep. Her past and his had converged to try and tear their family apart. Clara stepped onto the porch, positioning herself between the men and the doorway, where the children were huddled, their faces pale with fear. She was no longer the frightened girl on the auction block. She was the matriarch of this land, and she would not be moved. You want to talk about unfit, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the dusty yard. You, she said, pointing a finger at her ex-husband, threw me away because I couldn't give you an heir. You, she pointed at her former mother-in-law, watched and called it justice. You value bloodlines and names, but you know nothing about family. She turned to the sheriff. This man, Thomas, gave me a home when I had none. These children gave me a purpose when I was told I was useless. We built a life here, not with money or fancy titles, but with our own two hands. This garden, she swept a hand toward the small, thriving patch of green, grew in a drought because we refused to let it die. That's family. Judah, now a tall young man, stepped out to stand beside her. Then Levi, then Gideon. Mira came and took Clara's hand. Even little Samson stood his ground, glaring at the intruders. She's our mother, Judah said, his voice deep and unwavering. This is our home, and you are not welcome here. The sheriff looked from the united family on the porch to the bitter, hateful faces of the accusers. He looked at the railroad man, whose interest was in land, not justice. He sighed, a long, weary sound. I don't see any prisoners here, he said, turning to Clara's ex-husband. I see a family. You've got no claim. Now, I suggest you all leave before you get charged with trespassing. Defeated, they turned and left, their wagon kicking up a cloud of angry dust. Clara watched them go, her children surrounding her, Thomas's hand resting on her shoulder. The ghosts of the past were finally banished. Years turned into decades. The children grew up and moved away, but they always came back, bringing their own children to the house that leaned against the wind. The ranch became a place of pilgrimage, a testament to a love that had bloomed in the most barren of soil. Clara's garden expanded, a wild, beautiful tangle of life that defied seasons and logic. Thomas carved a sign and hung it over the gate. It didn't say his name. It said, Clara's Garden. When she finally passed, they buried her under the big oak tree on the hill. Thomas carved her headstone himself. It read, Clara, she grew everything. He joined her a few years later, and they laid him by her side. The railroad eventually had to build around their land. The sign Thomas nailed to the fence post on the day they turned the railroad men away still stands, the letters weathered but clear. Not for sale. Travelers who pass that way sometimes stop and stare at the wild garden that seems to grow without a gardener, a riot of impossible color on a dusty ridge. They say the place is protected, that the love that built it was so strong it soaked into the soil itself. A love that was never meant to be, born from shame and secrecy, that proved to be stronger than death, drought, and progress itself. They built a family, and in doing so they built a legend. If you enjoyed this story of a love that refused to die, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.